Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. Now, before we get to this week's guest, I want to take care of a little housekeeping, or news, really. Next weekend, I am going to be in Columbus, Ohio for the inaugural Cartoon Crossroads Columbus Festival, where I'm actually part of the programming. Their website lists me as their special media guest and one of comics' great conversationalists, which is kind of flattering. During the show, I'm going to be interviewing Bill Griffith, Dylan Horrocks, Francoise Mouly, and Durf Backdurf in 4 separate sessions, not all at once. I don't think I could manage a panel like that with 4 really great artists and cartoonists. But if all goes well, and I do plan on having 3 separate redundancy systems in place for this, I'll roll those episodes out over the course of October. So you'll get to hear everything if you're not able to attend in Columbus next weekend. They do have a lot of other great guests on hand at CXC, which is how we know Cartoon Crossroads Columbus. In addition to the ones I'm interviewing, the show is going to have Kate Beaton, Art Spiegelman, Jaime Hernandez, Jeff Smith, Katie Skelly, Craig Thompson, and more, plus an exhibit hall with publishers and cartoonists. So if you're interested in making a last-minute trip to Columbus to check out the first CXC festival, visit cartooncrossroadscolumbus.com or cxcfestival.tumblr.com. It runs from October 1st to October 4th, 2015, and it's organized by Tom Spurgeon from comicsreporter.com, who was one of my earliest guests and a good pal of mine. And now, on with the show. Now, this week's guest is the great poet, essayist, librettist, and, well, all-around great guy, JD McClatchy. His friends call him Sandy, and, well, I wouldn't say we're exactly friends. I'm going to go with Sandy, too, for the course of this show. Now, I got the idea to record with Sandy after this summer's episode with Langdon Hammer, who wrote the fantastic biography James Merrill, Life and Art. Sandy was a good friend and confidant of Merrill's, and as I read over the course of the book and started to look up more of McClatchy's writing, I've kind of had the feeling he'd make for a very good conversation for the show. So I pitched him by email. I immediately pulled out the Clive James card, which really does carry a lot of weight, and that did seem to do the trick. So in the middle of August, I went up to visit him. We had a good conversation. Now, that said, I do have an utter fear that poets will quickly realize that I'm actually a moron about poetry. But even though I think Sandy did pick up on that pretty quickly, he was really accommodating about our respective levels of poetic literacy. Just to illustrate it literally, I did recently commission the great cartoonist Roger Langridge to draw a picture of what I feel like when I'm reading poetry. I put it on the blog post for this episode. If you don't have a chance to check it out, it consists of a gorilla in a dressing gown, slippers, and fez, holding a bubble pipe and reading a copy of Yeats, which happens to be upside down. So go to chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com and check out this episode, and that'll have the artwork for that in there. Now, as far as caveats go, because of the layout of his living room, Sandy elected to hold the microphone in hand rather than use the little table mount that I usually have. So because of the closeness to his mouth, that led to a few plosives as he spoke into the mic. I apologize for that. I just bought some windscreens so I can fix that sort of thing in future. That's all going to be part of my podcasting toolkit, which someday I will revise and republish a post about. Now, here's Sandy's bio from the flap copy of his recent poetry collection, Plundered Hearts. JD McClatchy is the author of 7 previous collections of poetry and of 3 collections of prose. He's edited numerous other books, including the Vintage Book of Contemporary American Poetry, and has written a number of opera libretti that have been performed at the Metropolitan Opera, Covent Garden, La Scala, and elsewhere. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, where he served as president from 2009 to 2012. McClatchy teaches at Yale University and is the editor of the Yale Review. And speaking of those opera libretti, when the conversation begins, we're having a discussion already in progress about one of my favorite novels, The Leopard by Giuseppe de Lampedusa. Longtime listeners know how important that book has been for me. JD has some very interesting news. Sorry, Sandy has some very interesting news about it as we get started, which you're going to hear in just a moment. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with JD McClatchy, better known as Sandy.
I have my Leopard story anyway.
Oh, yeah?
Sure. I did a libretto, opera libretto of it.
It's looked over your list. I didn't realize
the music is being written now.
Oh, okay. It hasn't been
That's
done
what
yet.
it hasn't premiered.
Oh my God, that's great.
And we had to get the permission of his adopted son, Gioacchino Tomasi, and who's just a charming man. We met several. He was the Italian consul, I think, or artistic consul in New York for 20 years, and he's very cosmopolitan, and his English is perfect. But he was very pleased. He had turned down several people to do the opera and gave permission to this New York composer, Michael Delira, with whom I'd worked a couple of times, and Michael asked me to do the libretto, and it was a favorite book. I reread the book several times. I did not look at the movie again because you don't want to go anywhere near that kind of property. But it was interesting because the whole point of the book is to keep things from happening, as it were. Whereas opera demands that things happen. Mm-hmm. And it was trying to find the odd balance between the story and the medium of opera that was the real challenge.
I mean, in the film, they add that huge battle scene, plus they make the ballroom is the centerpiece of the whole movie.
Right.
I'll be interested to see what you...
I really don't envy a composer that has to compete with the music in that film, which is Rota music is just so beautiful. I would hate to have that hanging over my piano.
Well, what was your first experience with The Leopard? And we may as well consider ourselves recording at this point.
I don't really remember.
You weren't 40 years old like me. So
no. And I read it. I read it 2 or 3 times. The last time I was in Italy at a sort of artist retreat, and I took it with me to read it again. I thought that would be a very nice setting to sit in a shaded Italian garden and read it. And it was just so lucky that the chance to make an opera out of it happened.
Is there a time frame for when it's
No, I have no idea. I have no idea. I know Thomas Hampson is interested in singing the lead part, and he'd be very good. The Leopard in the book is only 40 years old, but he seems to be much older than that. And Hampson's looks and all of that would be wonderful.
Doesn't have the Burt Lancaster giantism.
Something. The Act 1 ends. I have him in his bathtub, and the priest comes in, and then his nephew comes in, and they have the talk about how to keep things the same, everything must change, and so on and so forth. And slowly, the whole end of Act 1 is his getting out of the bathtub, being dried off by servants, and slowly being dressed. And on the other side of the stage, Colleggero, his great, vulgar counterpart, is joking around with his cronies. And finally, the Leopard, his pants, his shirts, his sashes, his metal, his perfume, they're clipped around it. And he becomes the Leopard and faces out at the audience like this. And his nemesis faces out and just sort of fades away. And the Leopard is just left there standing by himself. Curtain.
Nice. Writing in English?
In English, yeah. Okay. I couldn't write an intelligent thing in Italian.
Wasn't sure. I assume not, but
no. I translated a lot for various the Metropolitan Opera, but among others. But it's not good enough.
Given the body of your work, I wouldn't put anything past you.
But so. My English is good, so that's what counts.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. The real first question I was going to ask was, when we began corresponding in July about getting together, you wrote in an email, "I sail for London next week."
Yeah.
Is that a David Jackson "I don't fly" thing?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Who sails for
By
London?
Chance, I found out that the Queen Mary which I'd never been on. I used to do a lot when I was a kid and a teenager. I sailed on the original Queen Mary and lots of crossings with my parents and then by myself, but haven't for decades now. And I don't know how, paging through a magazine, found that the Queen Mary docked in London the day before my 70th birthday.
Oh, wow.
So I thought, hey, and my husband Chip had never been on a ship before. He didn't look forward to it, and in retrospect, he didn't like it.
But he got the experience.
But he can't say that I've never done that before. And so we just had a great dinner at Claridge's on my birthday and flew home the next day.
Wow. Okay.
A total indulgence.
That was I saw it. I'm like, I should probably ask for clarification about my sail for London tomorrow.
That's it's a great thing to be able to say in an email too. It sounds very
it was very grand. But again, having read the life of James Merrill, I thought, is he afraid of flying? That would have come up somewhere, I'm sure. But
no.
We'll actually talk about the James Merrill connection, if you're okay with.
Sure.
You mentioned having your 70th birthday, which makes you older than Merrill was when he passed.
Now I'm older than my father when he died. So the two most important men in my life, I think, my father and my and Jimmy Merrill. I've now thankfully outlived.
What does that make you think about? How has that affected you? That realization, or is it just a beating the clock?
Well, I mean, there's a certain regret that you didn't have more time to spend with those men. But I don't think about them, either one, as much as I used to. It's been so long since they did die. And if I had a bucket list, I would only have one item on it, and that is learn how to die properly. Which seems much harder to do than visiting Sicily or climbing Mount Everest.
I read Montaigne in full, and that
there you go.
seems to prepare me.
There you go. He was the one who thought about that. I mean, it's something that I think I have now. This summer, bought a cemetery plot here in Stonington Cemetery. You try to get your financial things in order. I had a depressing experience because your financial advisors say, their first question when you ask them to make up a retirement plan for you is, well, how long are you going to live?
Right.
And
if I knew that, I wouldn't need a financial plan.
There you go. Yeah. So I just fumbled around and I said, 90. And they nodded and they said, we'll get that to you. And about a week later, I went for my annual physical to my doctor. And I told him this story, and he hesitated for a minute. And he said, maybe you should say 85. And I was ready to walk out and fire this doctor on the spot. I said, "You're not the one who's supposed to be saying
to keep me alive till I'm 150."
Exactly. So there is that sense that it could be. And I've had cancer. I have diabetes. I have heart problems in the family. So I have every train headed right to me. So I thought, be grateful for the time you have. I feel great, but I know and think about the end more and more.
Did the experience, and you were with Merrill for many of his later years as he was in decline, did that experience help you understand or approach it better, or were you still too young to get what it really meant?
Probably. And he was someone who told me when he took me aside one day and told me that he had AIDS, and he asked me to cover for him and lie about it. Which I did, and for several years after his death. I suppose he may have wanted to spare his mother newspaper gossip and so on. But I jumped into action, as you would expect, and I convened doctors and got every piece of information I could to help him. But he finally just said, I'm the sort of person at a moment like this who just simply turns his face to the wall. Mm-hmm. He had no interest in fighting it, and medicine was just on the
it was just before you started to get the antiretrovirals.
Just before it became a chronic condition rather than a death sentence. And perhaps if he had kept himself alive, 6 months longer, those new pills would have been available. Who knows? But he was determined to lie, as it were, so that he could work and not become a poster boy for AIDS.
Sure.
And he did. So he had, over 10 years of work. And it increasingly became the subject of his work in ways that people perhaps only discovered after the fact. But because work was so important to him, he didn't want even his own death to get in the way of it.
Do you see that in your own approach?
No.
Good. Okay.
No.
Just making
I'm
sure.
a coward and would take any pill that I was told to take.
That's part of my question. Both, what did you learn from Merrill over the years, and what did you have to unlearn in the process
That's
of living?
an interesting question. Because,
and that can be poetry and life.
Because when I discovered his work and then became a friend, he wasn't a person whom I wanted to write like as much as he was a person I wanted to be like. It was his entire life, his manner was something. Of course, I couldn't duplicate that in any way. That was beyond some. But there was a certain sophistication and humanity that was involved in his witty, charming way, and he taught me to look beyond the callow youth, I was when I met him, and to set my stakes a little higher, both in terms of art and of life, to enjoy myself in ways that my strict Catholic, rigorous background wouldn't have allowed for. So he was an enormous influence in that way. And then, after, I never stopped adoring the man, but at the beginning of our relationship, I tried as hard as I could to write exactly like James Merrill for, 10 years so. And I've spent all the time since trying to write unlike him because, as one does, I think with strong influences, they become so pervasive that you realize that they become an impediment, a peril.
You say this with a copy of a Harold Bloom book right next to your shoulder.
It's unread, let's put it that way. Harold had an enormous influence on me. It changed the direction of my whole life. By one course I took with him at Yale. As an undergraduate, I was a classics major, so I was steeped in Latin and Greek texts from when I was a
You'd already
teenager.
come in with that education. Yeah,
did all this. It was astonishing. I went to a Jesuit prep school in Black, North Philadelphia. My father had gone there. I had very shortly thereafter no interest in the church whatsoever, but I always admired the Jesuits and the education I got from them. And in those days, it seems incredible now, when you were 14, you had to choose a curriculum to follow, either a science curriculum or a classics curriculum. Not hard choice for me, because I could barely add and subtract, but horrifying in its consequences that I never got past algebra. I never took a biology course or a chemistry course or a physics. I know, it's horrifying. And, when and especially living in the 20th century, which is a scientific century above all, I feel so deprived. On the other hand, I was reading Homer when I was 14. And that was a fortunate outcome. But so I did that in college, and then I switched to English when I got to Yale for graduate school. But I was only there for a year because that was the build-up for the Vietnam War. And the rule then was, if you were in your second year of graduate work, you could continue towards the degree that you were after. But if you were in your first year, you were liable to the draft. I had a bad number in the lottery. I scrambled to find a job that would give me a deferment. I taught for 3 years at a small college in Philadelphia. Returned then to Yale to finish up my PhD. And by the time I'd returned, in the years off, I had been suddenly started to read contemporary poetry, which I hadn't paid any attention to before. So that when I got back to Yale, still intent, as I had been at the beginning, to pursue a Renaissance specialization, I took a course with Harold Bloom on American poetry, which went up through Hart Crane, I suppose, in those days, and my eyes were just widened with how spectacular. Why would I study the English Renaissance? Why would I think about Shakespeare when I could read Whitman? And I never looked back. I thought, and then I began to write, on my own. Then But it was Harold who made me realize for the first time how high the stakes were. That if you're going to do this at all, and if you're going to do it well, you have to take your tasks as seriously as possible. You can't just write. I think I probably wrote, I've always written from childhood on. And I'm sure in those days, I wrote in order to give what I had done to my mother, not so that I would be loved more, but so that I would be preferred to my siblings. Oh, isn't little Sandy smart, or isn't he clever? Isn't he that? And that is a motive that many poets still have. Maybe that's part of my makeup now. Aren't I really better than Robert Pinsky or Louise Glück? It's an awful motive, terrible. But it is a kind of drive that you want to be preferred. Yeah. And it's not a motive that one is proud of, but
it's competition.
It's competition.
There's a degree, the more young writers I'm around, there's seemingly a lack of understanding. Not that it's a zero-sum game, but, in some respects, there's only one set of laurels to be passed around, right. And that's, it's sort of passed over in favor of safe spaces and the sort of community quilting idea of art that I, as somebody who doesn't exactly practice himself, nonetheless, I kind of want an era with people who are striving for greatness, not,
Yeah, it was Harold who taught me that you have to write for the dead, not for the living. You would have to take a line that you thought was particularly good and think to yourself, what would Elizabeth Bishop think of this line? What would Keats think of this line? And if you don't hold yourself to those kinds of standards, if you don't want to play with and write for the great dead, then it's trivial, inconsequential. If you want to play with the big leagues, then take steroids.
And do you feel that do you feel at your best that you've got work that's going to last?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I've been lucky. First time, again at Yale, Robert Penn Warren had an office in the college that I was associated with as a young teacher. And one day I just had a sheaf of poems and I knocked on his door, and he opened the door and I introduced myself and I said, "Mr. Warren, could I give you some of my poems to read?" Well, if I were Red Warren at that moment, I would have just slammed the door. But he couldn't have been more patient and encouraging. Took the poems home, wrote to me about them, encouraged this way or that. And to have had help like that at the beginning was an enormous boost. Did it make my poems any good? It made them a little glitzier, I think. I think the problem with all young poets that I shared was that at the age of 20 or 20, whatever, 25, I didn't have anything to write about. So I thought that if I just threw a handful of fairy dust up in the air, that all of the glitter would distract a reader from the fact that I didn't have anything to write about. And it was only later I learned about language, which is the first thing to learn, but it results in kind of hollow, pretty poems.
Pyrotechnics.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it took the while it takes to acquire scars on your heart for me to have something I felt that was worth writing about.
Did you feel at the time you hadn't lived? Because even that's recognition in and of itself that most people don't have. They think their experiences at 22 are the most intense and unique that anyone will ever experience.
And as I said, I had a very strict conventional upbringing. Mm-hmm. Not literary at all. I don't ever remember being read to by my parents. And I never remember my parents even later on taking the slightest interest in my education or in my writing. But what they did do was saying, "That's nice, dear." And that was enough. I wasn't being forbidden. Yeah. I was being vaguely patted on the head and encouraged. That was enough. And I'm grateful for that. Many people didn't get that.
But they had lived to see you achieve some renown
Yes, yes, and that was very nice. Although I don't think it meant a thing.
That's I'm wondering. Did they
them.
get it, or was it just I don't know this stuff he writes about?
I know. I remember my mother. My mother came the first time I got an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and I was being given some little prize, and I invited my parents. And there was a lunch, and I remember my mother sitting down on a bench, and she was next to Diana Vreeland. No. She was next to Louise Nevelson, the sculptor. Of course, my mother had no idea who Louise Nevelson was, and I don't even know whether they introduced themselves to one another. But they immediately got into a big talk about baking or bus lines or something, like easy conversation, nothing to do with art. And that made my mother feel very comfortable and happy. And she would have been terrified if Louise Nevelson had turned on her
and started
wanted to talk about sculpture.
Right. Well, I don't know what.
And
it
was that kind of childhood and strict religious. So I didn't feel that I had the sex, drugs, and rock and roll life that my contemporaries seem to have had. I tried to make up for that when I was in graduate school a little bit. It was probably half-hearted.
It would have been the late 60s. So, it would have been the late 60s.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Exactly. So
it's understandable.
It was what one did in those days.
I think I'm born in 1971. I missed the whole shebang.
Yeah, you didn't miss too much.
Ultimately, what pushed you towards poetry? You've mentioned selecting the classics versus science at 14, but was it simply the verbal acuity, the need to write, ending up finding its form?
I think it's simply because it's something I could do. Mm-hmm. I had always wanted to be a teacher, and I pursued a PhD. And in those days, you did a PhD in 4 years, not the 10 years it takes people now to do. And my education had been interrupted by those 3 years of teaching. So although I was probably a ghastly teacher, I got my sea legs at least before I then went out and taught at Yale. And then I taught for 10 years at Princeton and then came back at Yale. I loved the academic environment. I loved my colleagues. I loved the amount of leisure time it actually leaves you to live with books. And so it gave me the time to do what I found I could do. And when I started teaching at Yale, I was teaching, I don't know, whatever you teach, regular courses, composition, Beowulf to Virginia Woolf kinds of teaching. And I began to publish more and more poetry, which came to the attention of the department. And they said, well, why don't we have you teach a poetry writing course instead of a course on John Donne or something like that? So I said, okay. And then that grows over time and continues to push you along in that direction. But I was in my late 30s when I published my first book. Like Whitman, let's say, or like Stevens, not a bright, precocious beginner at any point, I think.
This is a non-judgmental question. Your entire career has been spent in academia, right?
Yes.
Okay. Which is another way of saying you never really worked a day in your. I'm just kidding.
Well, sort of. I mean, I worked for the Metropolitan Opera as well.
Okay,
that might be the musical equivalent of academic life, or certainly of Yale. But I do. But yes, you're right. I think, and people. You often read people talking about how deadly that is.
And that's what I'm wondering. Do you see that as limiting, or do you get enough experience outside?
You have a life to live. You don't just have a job to do.
And you don't write poetry about academic politics.
No.
Which is very important.
No. You have a love life. You have a life in the world. You have to pay the same bills that everybody else has to pay. You have to do the same stupid things and experience the same pleasures that everyone else does. And I don't know why people think that an academic life is either inhibiting to one's imagination or somehow an illegitimate way of spending one's time. I think it's been great. I've loved every bit of it. And at Yale, as at Princeton, it's kept me in touch with the brightest of the young folk consistently. It's my colleagues who, I can turn to this historian or that chemical engineer to have a lunch with and talk over a particular question with. And I've loved that.
How have the students changed? We started to talk about it a little off mic, but you've been teaching for a few decades.
I'm not sure that I've noticed. I mean, the fashions change, passions change. They can be less political. They are less political now, I think. But the sexual politics has replaced social politics, or whatever the distinction would be, I think, now. But it's the same old tiresome ideologies that young minds are content with, and my job is to contradict them and to make them think, and to upset all of the easy attitudes and opinions that they have for being 20 years old. And that's the only part after all this time that I continue to enjoy about teaching, is watching their eyes widen. Oh my God, I'd never thought about that before. Yeah. Oh, you mean it could be this way, and not that way. And that's gratifying for me. Otherwise, I'm tired of the sound of my own voice after all this time. My ideas don't change, yearly. And I, as anybody, you're tired of what you do and have done for decades. And I would like to retire so that I could get more work done. But the experience of watching kids grow up imaginatively and grow into, or out of themselves rather than into themselves, as a first shedding of a false skin, is still, I take that very seriously as my responsibility as a teacher. And I enjoy watching it happen.
In that respect, what did you learn through the process of teaching, especially early on? Were there things that you picked up on that, oh, actually, this was a great technique when I was a student, or this is something that I wish somebody had done for me when I was 18, 19?
I guess so. I don't know. It's funny. I taught in 1978 the first gay literature course at Yale. I was subsequently let go from Yale because the faculty was so angry about that. I learned many things from that. One, when the course had to be approved by the English department, I thought that the black members of the faculty, for example, would be natural allies for me. In fact, because the pie slice for minorities is so small, they became your enemy for this, rather than a champion. Zero-sum
game of
exactly. Yeah. That was a good lesson to learn. And then I found the course was called Literature and Homosexuality. And about 3 or 4 weeks, maybe sooner, into the term, the students all came to me and asked if I would change the name of the course, because they were afraid that if that title went back on a transcript to their mommy and daddy,
permanent record.
Boom.
Yeah.
And so I said, of course, I didn't want to embarrass him. And it became The Literature of Ambiguity or something, some idiotic title like that. But it was really very funny. I got let go by Yale, according to Harold Bloom, who was in the faculty meeting, because of it. And within 3 years, they had hired Wayne Kestenbaum specifically to teach gay literature. Things were moving that quickly along. And a couple of weeks ago, I had an email from Finland from a girl whom I don't remember at all, who was in the class. And she wrote a long poem about how it had changed her life profoundly. And every author that was in the course, she had something to say about it. She said nothing had stuck with her more than that one course. And this was 30 years later. And that's why I take my responsibility as a teacher so seriously, because you do have an effect that you can't know about or calculate on young lives that means so much to them, and you are completely unaware that you've made this kind of impression or pushed them in that particular direction. And so it's often very gratifying.
That's great. Do you teach the literature of homosexuality now?
No.
Or is it more...
No.
It's so incorporated
into
the canon
again.
As it is? Okay, I wasn't sure if there's even a need to at that point.
Yeah.
So.
I feel I am gay. I don't do gay.
And at that time, though,
the presence of it in my poems, because it's my life and my body and my experience. But I'm not a member of any organization. I don't give speeches about this. I don't. I have too much else to do.
Yeah. That said, could you have imagined back in 1978 or 88 or 98 that A, you'd be getting married to a guy, and B, you would be in the New York Times wedding section?
No.
That's okay.
Totally astonishing, the speed with which these social changes have come. And I think of, larger groups like blacks and especially women who still are struggling to get what seems to have been dropped into the laps of the gay community. I don't know how this happens. Well, everybody in America knows somebody who's gay in their own family, and they don't have a family member who's black, for example, and they know that these people are perfectly normal and nice, and I like them, and I guess the other ones are. Why women remain, but that's been in the part of the human nature since cave times, I suppose.
There's things you can say in shorthand that actually come off terribly when somebody listens to them and out of context. So I'm not going to go into where the disparities lay, why they keep proliferating. Again, filled with my own theories on this, and then realize what a terrible person they make me sound like when I relate them.
But also being able to marry is one thing, but there is still behind my back things are still said. As they always have been. But that hasn't changed.
As a Jew, I still feel that.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
We hear the dog whistle for various
exactly
things.
So
it's if it doesn't turn out to be physically violent or holding us back economically,
right?
You seem to be doing okay. Is all I'm saying.
That's right.
It's in this amazing home in Stonington. Which brings us back to James Merrill yet again. You live in the town. How nearby was his home?
He's about 3 or 4 blocks up that way. And that was my introduction to this town. I'll tell you the story of how we met. I had been reading his poems in the New Yorker, and then they had been gathered into a book, came out in 1972 or 73, called Braving the Elements, which I bought and just was knocked down by. It is his most knotty book. It's very obscure, very difficult, intense poems. And it was that I thought was so glamorous and alluring. The fact that I couldn't understand these things, and yet they were in front of you like
and you were still in grad school?
I was in grad school.
Okay, so that makes sense. That's good. Okay.
And so I wrote him a fan letter, in care of his publisher in New York. Didn't hear anything for 3 or 4 months, and then an air letter, a little thin blue air letter, came from Athens, where my letter had been forwarded, where he was living. And he thanked me for my letter very perfunctorily. And for some reason, it could have dropped right there, and I could have gone on reading him. But I had recently found in a bookstore in New Haven an oblong, leather-bound book with a fine hand written on it, and it turned out to be a diary kept by a young American woman, on her first tour of Europe with her impressions of things. And she had been at the first performance of La Traviata, and she had no idea what it was she saw. And she talked about how the next day in the streets people were singing the tunes and humming, and everybody was talking about this opera. But I thought, I sent it to Jimmy. I thought he'd be charmed by this account of this silly little girl who had no idea that she was in the presence of a masterpiece and didn't know what to make of it. And he loved it. And he wrote back and he said about how much he loved all of this. And it was so funny. And he said, I'm coming in April to give a reading at the Y in New York City with Elizabeth Bishop. And why don't you come down from New Haven and come to the reading? So I did. And Miss Bishop read first, and then came into the audience to hear Jimmy read, who was the best reader of poetry that there ever was, and Bishop was one of the least good. She admired Merrill's reading technique. So when he finished, he was backstage, and I was going to go to the green room reception area to meet him, but my mother had taught me to be polite, so there was Miss Bishop still in the auditorium. So I went up to her and I thanked her for the reading. She didn't say anything to me. She would say, "Go up and get my watch." And she had left her watch on the lectern up there, and Jimmy hadn't noticed it either when he read. I went up on the stage of the Y, got her watch, brought it to her, didn't even say thank you, just took the watch. And I thought, wow, what a tough broad she is. And then I made my way around to the reception area, and there was Merrill, but by this time he was surrounded by a group of admirers, and all he wanted, it was clear, was to light a cigarette. But every time he took one out to light, someone would push a book in front of him to sign, and he couldn't light the cigarette. So the next time he took a cigarette out, I reached in. We all smoked in those days, early 70s, and took my little trusty Bic out, put my hand through the 3 rings of people around him with a flame. He lit the cigarette and looked up with such gratitude at whoever had lit the cigarette. And I said, "Hi, I'm Sandy McClatchy." And he said, "Oh, you're Sandy McClatchy." Blah, blah, blah. And he said, "Well, why don't you come up for dinner some night?" I lived in Dumpy, New Haven. I was delighted to get out. I'd never been to Stonington before, but it was going to be more interesting than where I lived as a graduate student. And I did. And he sent me then a postcard with directions on it, how I would drive up 95 and what exit I would take. And I remember a phrase in it that is so absolutely Merrill. He said, you'll come to this big building on the left, at 107 Water Street. It used to be painted aubergine, but it's been repainted a shade of leg makeup now. And I thought, wow, that's a way to describe colors that I hadn't. And it was that kind of, just every phrase made your heart leap with its strangeness and aptness. And he just seemed to use language to be one step ahead of experience, be able to look back on it and describe the middle of it at the same time.
Yeah, I have to say your experience of trying to write like Merrill for 10 years, when I read the biography this summer, I did find myself actually starting to compose a little, largely about the history of my very nondescript house. But I lay down and, the feeling went away after a couple of hours. But, it was nice to have a few lines put together. But after that, I thought, I'm not. It's nice that the use of his poetry in the biography kind of seeped its way into me. But I thought I'll just not.
I'm in the process of editing now his selected letters that come out in a couple of years. The last task,
you're a co-literary executor of his.
I am, and it's I've put a lot of time into all of this, and it's time to turn it over to other people. But reading through the tens of thousands of letters that he wrote, every one of which has a turn of phrase in it that is just delights you, and also his strange ability. And it says, I learned this about his personality in ways that I hadn't before now by reading the letter. He writes a letter from Santa Fe, for example, and he describes a Hopi Pueblo dance that he had attended to with snake charmers and all of this. And it's riveting. And 2 paragraphs later, he's talking about some bit of gossip in town or, this or that. And you think, oh my God, this one piece of writing. And if we just took the things that were well written, then you'd have a book that was just little pieces of beautiful writing. The fact is that it was all part of the same person. The trivial and the sublime existed side by side in his personality, which makes him seem a little more human.
Yeah. And that's the one thing when you're not... when you're getting more than just the highlights, you realize people are people.
Yeah.
One thing did come up. I was reading an interview with you. You mentioned an Anne Sexton episode that involved a Ouija board experience.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, which, given Merrill and Jackson's extensive Ouija board experience leading to the Changing Light at Sandover, just has me wondering, what's your take on the other world? Both in general and that specific one that they evoked.
Yeah, I had an experience just this month that taught me a lot about it, or it clarified what I think I have always thought about this.
Yeah.
A friend of mine wrote to me. I hadn't been in touch with him in a long time. He was an ex of mine, and we hadn't seen one another for 25 years, maybe. And he sent me a book that he'd written, and I felt that I had to write back to him, and I sent a postcard. And that prompted a letter about a week later, a long letter, and said that in 12 hours he was going in to have a brain tumor removed at Dartmouth Hanover Hospital. He, 25 years ago, had survived non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he said, I thought I had had all of this behind me, but now this thing is going. But what had happened and how it had manifested itself is that he had a seizure one day. Such a violent seizure, he was thrown backwards and he broke both of his shoulders in the fall. I mean, it was that, you can imagine how huge that was. It was at that point they discovered this brain tumor. They sent him home and with more diagnosis to come. He had another seizure and they pushed up the operation. But meanwhile, the tumor on one side of his head had grown so that it pushed on transmitters on the other side of his head, which gave him incontinent auditory seizures. When his mind was constantly filled with loud conversations, music, constantly. And it was everything that he had ever heard, overheard, thought about, seen. Nixon is announcing his re-election bid. Little Richard is singing Tutti Frutti. A little girl is ice skating. A rabbi's nail goes down a Torah. Endless auditory hallucinations. And it meant that, we hear all these stories about the brain editing out the day's detritus, when in fact everything we have ever experienced is all there. So the fact that people hear voices on a Ouija board, when people ever questioned me about that, I said, well, how about your dreams? Where do they come from? They're as extraordinary as anything.
The gates of horn and the gates of ivory, for God's sake.
So, no, I don't believe that there's anything is out there at all. But there's so much in here that it can manifest itself in very haunting and touching ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I was hoping that was going to be the case. That was a big part of my conversation with Lanny Hammer about the Merrill bio. Was sort of,
I don't know what Lanny feels. I'm sure it's the same thing.
I think it was a psychological, especially the two-person thing makes it more, because of some neurologists' studies on this, it makes it more plausible for two people to be doing something that neither one is exactly conscious of doing. I think
that's true. I did it with Jimmy, myself, somewhat, and then with my boyfriend at the time, did it for some years and found it absolutely riveting. And he was the one who broke it off. I would still be doing it today if I was interested, and if he were still, thank God he's not, but if we were still living together.
The idea of Stonington, the idea of the number of homes we've talked about earlier before we started recording, puts me in mind of another book that you did, non-poetry, part of a coffee table book of American writers' homes. How significant is space for you? Is the particular location in which you're writing, in which you're working?
Yes, very important. That was a trouble, for example, when we bought a place in Florida to escape the brutal winters up here now, and when my schedule allowed me to spend time down there. It took me 4 years. I had a study there. I made a study. I had a desk built. I got a computer there. I had the reference books that I need, and I just would sit there and nothing would happen. And it took me 4 years. I mean, it's just like how long it takes a dog to circle a rug until he finds exactly, and he sits exactly where he was every other time. That I do believe that places have a kind of karma to them. And I'm used to working in my study out there. Before I moved here, I lived in a small apartment in New York that I had a makeshift desk in a closet, and I would pull a chair up to the closet, open the closet doors, and that was my study. But I do most of my reading in bed, always have, and but I write out there in that study, and it takes me a long time to know how to write somewhere else.
Interesting. The coffee table book was photographed by someone else who did all the trips. Do you find yourself making pilgrimages to write? Okay, I wasn't sure because you did show me
somebody
earlier.
Somebody asked me to write the book.
Okay, but just in general, do you have any sort of interest in where other writers work or live?
I
or
have,
where they're from?
Sure. I know so many writers now, and I've been to their homes that I.
Yeah, but were there ones you sought out? Like you wouldn't go to Big Sur to go see Henry Miller's,
No, but I went to see Robinson Jeffers' home there, but that was that was all because of the book.
I'd wondered because earlier you showed me a lot of the letters and other what do we even call those?
Memorabilia?
That sounded too cheap to me. But if you're okay with that, then I am too. So great pieces from great writers and artists of the past. When did that? Let's say fetishization, I guess. I don't know, whatever you want to call it, collection of memorabilia.
Yeah, these are like
relics
or, sea shells that you bring back from your summer vacation. I did it actually as a kid. I wrote letters to people like Walt Disney, Stan Musial.
I was going to go with baseball players.
I wrote to Khrushchev. I would write to say, Ezra Taft Benson, I remember, who was the Secretary of Agriculture under Dwight Eisenhower. And so I would write to him and said, I'm interested in becoming a farmer. Could you give me some advice? And the poor Secretary of Agriculture couldn't ignore that, and he would write back a letter. I made all these interests up, of course.
Your Future of America.
I wanted to go, because I was so in love with the classics, I wanted to go as a high school student to Greece. So I wrote to Queen Frederica of Greece and said, could she recommend some places for me to visit in Greece this summer, when I'm coming. And I thought, well, why not? I mean, she didn't write back, but one of her ladies in waiting did, and Her Majesty has asked me to, blah, blah, blah. So I always thought it was just natural to write to the people who were famous and whom I was interested in. And that may have started this. Herbert Hoover, I remember. I've lost all these letters. He was quite angry at me. People sell letters of mine, and it takes me a lot of time to do this. He was very grumpy. And but here I had one. And so I've collecting letters somehow has been in my genes from the beginning. Why, I have no idea.
You just got more rarefied tastes and moved on to Hausman and Proust.
Yes, much better taste. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, of the different forms you work in poetry and criticism and libretti translation, do you find a common thread in particular outside of everything is verbal? Or do you find a certain set of challenges in each one that doesn't exactly?
I think the latter is more the case because they're very different kinds of writing.
Yeah.
Opera wants a certain use of language that is really quite different from poetry's more intense and lyrical effusions. Everything needs to be plainer. And because it has to be understood through a soprano and a 100-piece orchestra to an audience that is half asleep after 2 martinis and dinner. And also I think about things that I wouldn't think about. I think about rhythm and rhymes and assonance and all that when writing a poem, but I don't have to think about whether a singer could pronounce a certain vowel at this pitch, or something like that. Yeah. Those are very technical questions. Prose, I love writing and find it much easier to do than writing. It comes, although I work on it, it comes more naturally. I also use different machines for different kinds of writings. Really? I write letters on a Selectric IBM typewriter. Okay. I write essays on a computer, and I write poems by hand. Simply because each process or each instrument, a hand, a typewriter, a computer, takes a certain amount of time. It's slowest to write. I find it, letters actually, I think when you write a letter, you go deeper into yourself than you ever do in conversation. You think about what you're going to write. You reveal things in letters that you might not in casual conversation. And it requires a certain measured pace to write a letter, whereas prose, essays or reviews or something like that come more or less off the top of my head, and I write much more quickly. And
also go back in and tweak. And
of course.
Edit.
Of course.
I'm just astonished because a few years from now, people will wonder what on earth you're talking about when you say a letter.
I know.
That's a huge.
I know.
Do you find yourself generally still sending letters as opposed to emails?
Not as much as I did before.
Okay.
It's just too easy, and especially in a busy life, to dash off the email. But the most...
except when you're sailing for London, then you can...
But the most interesting letters, the most interesting correspondence I have is still by a written letter with people. It's more serious. Emotions and experiences are described at greater and more interesting length than they ever are in emails. And though I'm told, my papers are at Yale Library, and I'm told that they will be coming at some time to harvest my computer.
I wondered how that process works. Woo! Also. Yeah.
Kind of frightening.
Given what you've gone through as Merrill's literary co-executor, are there things you think about in terms of your own papers and how you... Did you prepare it all? Do you have any instruction for whoever has to deal with this when I'm gone? These are some of the things you need to keep in mind? Or is it just an open-ended resource?
I think Yale, the Beinecke Library does...
They've been doing it for a while.
I trust them entirely.
I wasn't sure if there's any sort of input from the source himself. So, because no one is ever going to say, we need the Gilroth letters. That's not going to... They will come back and get this. I'm convinced this is going to be an archive someday, though.
Yes, of course it will be.
These
and
files
a very interesting one. I've tried to tell Chip, who is not the most literary person in the world, my husband, to be careful when I'm gone to make sure that books that are, say, inscribed to me are not just thrown in the church box for the town fair to be sold, to be careful about going through things to make sure that, and anything that looks like it would be valuable, he's perfectly happy to sell. And whether he sells with a binding or not, I don't care. It's not going to make a difference, but don't throw it out by mistake.
Right. Or you can take it down to the Strand and do his thing.
Exactly.
I do have questions from some past listeners. First is our past guests. First one is Willard Spiegelman, who you'll be somewhat flattered. How does he find the energy to handle so many projects with speed, clarity, grace, and efficiency? We can just go with how do you find the energy to do all these things? But
I do get that question more often than
I think at 70, people don't expect you to be handling so many things at the same time and teaching full time as you do.
I honestly don't know. To be honest with you, I think of myself as a lazy person. And yet I will look at the shelves over there and see that there are 60, 70 books I've probably written, and I cannot remember writing any one of them. I'm only interested in what I'm doing now or next. I have no interest in anything I've done. So I only ever think that I have one or two little things to do.
They just all pile up onto the shelf.
Exactly.
The great line I heard about it, which I think applies in my case and maybe yours, I work incredibly hard so that people won't realize how lazy I am. That might be part of it.
That's even more Baroque.
Or more of an erotic Jew.
I think I steal that line.
Feel free. I think I've stolen it from somewhere. That might work better for the neurotic Jew as opposed to Jesuit-trained Catholic.
Go.
But there's a degree of...
I feel so fortunate to have... opera came rather late into my life. It was in the mid-'80s or something. Just a telephone call out of the blue from a composer who asked me if I would write a libretto for him. I'd never thought about doing that. Mm-hmm. But though I had been going to the opera, I had been listening to the Met broadcast all my life and was passionate about it, I had absolutely no experience in actually writing. So I said, sure.
How tough could it be?
Why not? And then suddenly it becomes a whole second career. And there are those accidental treasures that drop at your feet, and if you're smart enough to pick them up, instead of thinking, no, I can only do this one thing, why not?
Or create a second job for yourself, driving all over the place and interviewing people.
There you go.
That's a side thing. The other question, which puzzles me, but maybe will make sense to you, comes from Clive James. I said, well, I'm going to be interviewing. I wasn't sure. You mentioned that you like him. I'd said, I'm interviewing JD McClatchy this weekend. Any questions? He asks, what would you do if Ezra Pound were still alive, had another dozen cantos, and wanted you to publish them serially in the review?
That is a tough question.
Oh, good.
Because like Ezra Pound, I like Clive James, I loathe the work of Ezra Pound. Mm-hmm. Loathe everything about the man and the work.
Yeah.
I was a friend of his daughter, Mary Rackwilts, who lived around New Haven, and she was charming. She once told me that her father had said to her, I don't want my work understood. I want it read. I don't care whether anybody gets it.
Yeah.
But his,
which makes everything so much clearer when you get that.
If somebody threw down on my desk The Wasteland and asked me to read it and comment on it, I don't think I'd be smart enough to realize what was in front of me. Mm-hmm. Pound was. He had an enormous influence, but he was a pain in the neck from the beginning, and he became just a ghastly, immoral person. And the work became of no interest. I know he still has champions. But on the other hand, would I publish his work? As an editor, as a person, as a writer, I feel one thing. As an editor, then I am responsible to the readers of my magazine. Sure. And for historical reasons, I might very well publish those poems. And without any... I remember my successor as editor of the Yale Review. There was a Pound conference at Yale, and he had said to all the participants that he would publish their papers in the Yale Review. One of these papers, actually by a poet, soi-disant poet named Charles Bernstein, was apparently awful, just awful. And he wrote to Mr. Bernstein. He said, "I'm sorry. I know I promised you could write, but I simply can't write you." He came back and said, "I'm going to sue Yale University. I promised." He made a pill, just like Ezra Pound himself. So my predecessor did a very intelligent thing. He did print the review in the Yale Review, the piece, but he printed it in a typeface so small that no one could read it. And there are ways around these moral dilemmas, I hope.
There's also something that I wonder about. Your husband, very comic book, cartoon strip oriented. He's worked a lot on Batman projects, Charles Schultz, etc. Yeah. In the same Paris Review interview you did, you say, "I think of a sequence of sonnets as a strip of cartoon panels, each an episode." Comics ever mean anything to you?
No.
Beforehand? Before you'd met him? Okay.
And still don't. I don't. I never read them as a child. I think I read Dick Tracy because it was the first.
Yeah, it was on the front page of the comics section of the Daily News.
And that was about it. I have never read them over the years, or graphic novels and whatnot. All the things that Chip is interested in, I am not. But I think there's an actual sort of biological reason for that. I simply cannot take in information that is presented that way.
Yeah,
I can only take it in by reading text.
Yeah, I know people who will read the word balloons and captions, but can't connect it with images
I am
that are happening
way,
at the same time.
And that must be some, genetic inability. I didn't remember.
Yeah, I think it's constrained only to people who are productive. But I'm not sure.
I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but no, I have
from all
no
the time I've wasted reading comics,
but
I figure.
In that instance, it was a good image to use for a sonnet sequence.
I guess I don't want to go too much into married life because this show really isn't about that level of private life with things. But is there that sense of balance of, high and low culture in the relationship, or do you feel that, everybody carries their own high and low? I don't want you to speak for someone who isn't here. That's
no, not that. But I think speaking for myself, we met over 20 years ago, and when we fell in love and started living together, I realized if I had met another over-cultivated person, I would just have shot myself. I had known so many and had lovers before who would, we could go on endlessly about French novels or about, Baroque opera and whatnot. And I thought, oh, thank God, he doesn't know anything about this. And there's this whole pop culture world that I knew nothing about, wasn't enormously interested in, but it was something new. And so the experience had a kind of liveliness to it being together. He introduced me to a lot of stuff that doesn't stick with me, but on the other hand, he's been to 3 ring cycles that I've dragged him to, and which he boasts about. I think
that equals 1 San Diego Comic-Con.
There you go.
I'm not sure if that's the equivalent.
Absolutely.
So if he drags you out to that'll be a real sign of commitment beyond marriage or anything else. But yeah, I had wondered in those terms if there's that balancing act. And honestly, I've known
it's people... not just. It's not the work he does on comics, but his day job really is as a graphic designer and doing book covers and graphic design. I've learned so much from him and have a real interest in that. The weight and value of type and the relationship between type and image and all of that stuff that I just took for granted before I met him. I find that all really.
You don't do the shaped poems that Merrill used to do? Okay.
No, I don't.
that would sort of be the bridge crossing over those interests. Although you are working on a Commonplace book, or you finished a Commonplace book.
Yes, it's coming out next March.
Can you talk about it a little? What led to it and
Sure.
how you put it together?
What led to it was just realizing that I had kept books for over 30, maybe 40 years, in which I had transcribed phrases, long passages that I admired in other books. But this was a common thing in the ancient world. People from Cicero to Erasmus kept these things. They were usually bits of moral philosophy or great poems that orators and students would study as great, so they could have an anthology of great examples of something. In the 18th century, these turned personal. And people from Ralph Waldo Emerson to Alec Guinness have kept these books. It used to be a way of when books were a rarity, you could copy down parts of a book you liked before you had to return the actual book to the person who owned it. And that way you could keep for yourself the part that
the good stuff.
The good stuff, as it were. And I just found, looking through it, I always had in mind to publish this book, and I took about half of it. I put a lot of stuff about poetry to one side, particular things, but it's still subtitled. It's called Sweet Theft, a phrase in a poem by Ben Jonson, and it has a supertitle of a poet's commonplace book. So to let a reader know that it is more literary than it is, political or, aquatic or sports centric. But it's maybe 250, 300 pages of stuff that I think other people will be riveted to read.
Do you feel a sense of responsibility for the culture? I mean, you talk about that in terms of the students, how they're going to grow into something. Do you feel a sense of, not in the Buckley, standing athwart, et cetera, but do you feel a need to conserve?
I do. I have
something?
A traditional sensibility, I think.
Yeah.
I was raised to think that the great treasures of Western civilization have created us and have been and are needed to sustain us. Pop culture has obviously triumphed over high culture in the society at large. No question about that. There's no, Toscanini and the Philharmonic are not on the radio every Sunday, that sort of thing. And pop culture has defeated people like me, have been pushed to one side, and now it's celebrity driven or hip hop or all of the stuff that means absolutely nothing to me, in which I come sometimes to loathe, but learn, I hope finally, just to ignore and pay no sense, except when I am teaching. Mm-hmm. And then I will push the students towards the very best that I can and make them pay attention to that, hoping that some of it sticks. It's hard because we live in a very noisy culture. Right. There's so much competition for the little attention each one of us has, and it must be especially true for the young, where the pressures they're under.
The idea is that they're digital saturated natives and that they're somehow capable of filtering all this stuff, but I think it's just going to lead to people bumping into each other because they're too busy looking at.
I think you're right,
yeah.
And I want to try to make for them some quiet spaces to teach them that thinking about their lives is just as important as living their lives, and that's why they're there. It seems to me at a university.
Final question: who are you reading?
Well, the question comes at an odd time because
there's always who have you been reading. You can always throw that in too.
Yeah, but I mean, it comes at an odd time. Having, just today I do the super titles for the Metropolitan Opera for the new productions that don't have titles on them. I've done this for years, and just today I was doing Act 1 of The Pearl Fishers, which is opening up by Bizet, a second-rate opera with some very, very beautiful music in it. Opens up on New Year's Eve this year at the Metropolitan. And so I've been reading that because I've been translating from the French. It's really pretty awful. But as I mentioned, I was just last week on the Queen Mary for a week, and I had all the time in the world to read. And I took with me to read a book that I am embarrassed to say I had never read before, and that is The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which I found very sludgy.
I read 100 pages of it in college and never went back. It's been over 20 years. Do you recommend it?
I was really dutiful to get through to page 900.
And that's part of why I never went back.
It was hard reading. But I also read on ship one of the best novels I'd read in a long time. I thought, especially having been raised a Catholic, Graham Greene was always a writer whom I read intently, and I thought I had read everything, but at least I don't remember having read this before. A 1973 novel of his called The Honorary Consul, set in Argentina, and it was absolutely wonderful book. I just couldn't read it fast enough. Greene is not a flashy writer. He's not a stylist in any way, but he's a tremendous storyteller and moralist, and it was wonderful.
Did you go see the redo of the reissue of The Third Man at the Film Forum in New York City? Oh,
no,
God. They got a restored edition, and I only discovered the movie about 5 years ago, which is an embarrassment on my part because it informs almost every movie I love subsequently. But I'd never seen it in a theater before, so that was that was absolutely wonderful. I'd read Green's novella treatment of it earlier this year, I think. But yeah, that's just a wonderful
I look forward
experience.
to seeing that.
It's something. Anything on the horizon? Any book? Actually, this is the great humiliation question from that David Lodge story. Book that you're kind of embarrassed that you haven't read besides the Thomas Mann?
Well, I haven't read any of the other novels either. Joseph and His Brothers, Dr. Faustus, Buddenbrooks. I haven't read the big. I've read the short stories, but I haven't read the big one. And I'm not sure that I'm going to rush to do that either. Right
we
now.
did talk about the limited time.
He's a little heavy. I'm reading a book right now called *Sapiens*, and it's by Yuval Noah Harari, and it's about a brief history of humankind. And it's absolutely fascinating book. The older I get, the more I like to read nonfiction, and that's why I like biographies and war, military histories. And this is a fascinating book about why Homo sapiens came to dominate the 6 other human species that had evolved. And
it's because of poetry, right?
Well, you never know. But it's an interesting story. The origins of money and agriculture and technology, how all these things made us the way we are today. And so I do try to keep up on, and not just reading frivolous novels by Thomas Mann.
I wouldn't call Mann frivolous, but we've all got our standards.
And I just read Clive James's new book before I left, Sentenced to Life. It's not going to be published here in the States, except eventually as part of a larger collected poem. But I had ordered it from England, and just superb. Just superb.
So good. His new essay collection just came out, also a short collection called Latest Readings that you might want to see from Yale University Press. It's I took it on a flight last weekend. It's only 180 pages. I'll read a few during the flight. 2-hour flight, 130 pages later. I was like, oh, okay, I may as well finish it tonight as long as I'm it's absolutely wonderful. Any chance you get to, plumb a little bit of the knowledge that guy's built over the years.
You. And it's all nice. He's one of the few writers whom I read whom I agree with all the time.
Yeah.
That's rare and particularly pleasing.
Sandy McClatchy, thank you so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
Thank you, Gil, a lot.
And that was Sandy McClatchy. He doesn't have a website, as far as I can tell, but you can find his poetry and essays and the collections that he's edited in better bookstores. And this spring, he's going to have that Commonplace book out that we talked about. His newest collection is Plundered Hearts, which has both new and selected poems, and that's from Knopf. Also, you should check out that coffee table book I mentioned, which is American Writers at Home. It's photos of these preserved homes of great writers and essays from him, both about the writers themselves and the locations and what they mean. It's a really neat book. I think you'll dig it if you dig this sort of show. And even though I am no opera guy, I can't wait to see an opera of The Leopard with his libretto. Now, I want to thank Sandy again for the time and for giving me a tour of their Stonington home, which has this wonderful collection of letters and memorabilia that he's assembled over the years, which, again, we talked about, but until you actually get to see these postcards from Houseman and letters from Proust, you don't really get what it all means, It sort of reminds me of the great collection that Stefan Zweig had built but had to abandon when he fled Austria. Also, I want to apologize to Chip Kidd for dragging him into the conversation in absentia. I didn't feel super comfortable doing that, but Sandy felt just fine talking about his marriage and partner and the high-low culture split. All the same, I would love to sit down with Chip sometime and get his side of the story about sitting through the ring cycle so many times. So, Chip, if you're listening and you made it this far, please consider this an invitation. Now that's it for this week's show. Our music for this episode is our theme song, Nothing Is Gonna Bring Me Down, by David Bayerwald, which is used with permission from the artist. And that is it. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with a conversation with Scott McCloud, the cartoonist and theorist and futurist behind Understanding Comics, Reinventing Comics, Making Comics, Zot, and most recently, The Sculptor, a 500-page graphic novel from First Second. And until then, you can follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter at VMSPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. You can subscribe to the show and find our 100 most recent episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes, get on our email list, and make a donation to this ad-free podcast at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. As far as expenses go, this was part of an insane day where I spent about 6 or 7 hours driving through Connecticut. I first went to the home of Bill Griffith near East Lyme to record with him prior to our Columbus interview that'll be coming this week. That was kind of a long drive, and then I went on to Stonington to interview Sandy, and then had a very, very long drive home. And that was the entirety of my Saturday, basically about 3 to 4 hours of conversation and 6 or 7 hours of driving. And during that drive home, I thought about how absolutely crazy it is that I spend half my weekend doing this sort of thing. But I also thought about how absolutely great it is that I get to spend time talking to such amazing artists and writers, and that I get to share this stuff with you. So if you want to kick in a little money to thank me or at least help cover the tolls and coffee and gas, you can make a donation via PayPal at either of our websites, or just go to paypal.me/VMSpod, like Virtual Memories Show podcast. So paypal.me/VMSpod. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review, because that sort of activity really helps us when it comes to the podcast charts, and iTunes is sort of the de facto leader of the podcasting world. So by doing that, by leaving rating and review while you're there, or at least a rating, you can move us up, and maybe it'll lead to other people discovering this podcast. Until next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.